we can solve the mystery beyond doubt of who this skeleton actually is. None other than Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe, Egyptian rebel, Queen of Egypt.
When wildlife officials in Florida first announced the plan, biologists in other states didn't just doubt it, they mocked it outright. The idea sounded like something out of a bad monster movie: deliberately release enormous, glossy black serpents into the wild, on purpose, by the hundreds, with plans to eventually push that number into the thousands. Critics called it reckless. Late-night hosts joked about it. Homeowners in the Florida Panhandle worried they'd wake up to giant snakes in their backyards. But 2 decades later, the people who laugh the loudest are the ones eating their words, because what Florida built quietly in the pine forest near the Apalachicola River may be one of the most successful predator recovery stories in American history. And the creature at the center of it isn't a monster at all. It's a snake that kills other snakes, including some of the deadliest rattlesnakes in North America. And it might be the key to fixing an ecosystem that has been unraveling for almost a century. Picture the scene at the very first release back in 2017. A small group of scientists standing in a patch of restored pine forest, carefully lifting 2-year-old snakes out of transport containers and setting them down near the mouths of old gopher tortoise burrows, cameras rolling, decades of planning riding on whether these animals would simply vanish into the undergrowth and die, or somehow, against long odds, survive. Nobody watching that day could have promised it would work. What happened instead, slowly, quietly, over the years that followed, is the story we're about to tell. To understand why this program seemed so absurd at first, you have to understand what an eastern indigo snake actually is. This isn't some imported, invasive horror story like the Burmese pythons strangling their way through the Everglades. The eastern indigo is native. It has lived in the longleaf pine forests of the southeast for longer than humans have had a written language. It is, by measurement, the longest snake native to North America, with some individuals stretching past 8 feet. Their scales are deep, glossy black that shimmers an iridescent blue-purple in direct sunlight, with a splash of burnt orange or red along the chin and throat. Early European settlers who encountered them thought they looked almost otherworldly, like something forged rather than born. But the detail that made wildlife agencies willing to gamble hundreds of thousands of dollars and years of careful breeding on this species is simpler and far more useful. Eastern indigo snakes eat other snakes. Not occasionally, not as a last resort. It is a core part of their diet and their identity as a species. They will hunt down and consume rattlesnakes, copperheads, cottonmaids, and other indigos smaller than themselves, along with rodents, frogs, birds, and pretty much anything else that fits down their throat. Unlike constrictors that suffocate their prey by coiling around it, indigo snakes simply overpower their victims with raw jaw strength and swallow them alive, venom and all. They appear to have a natural resistance to the venom of the pit vipers they prey on, which lets them walk into a fight that would kill almost anything else and walk out unscathed. So when a handful of conservation biologists propose capturing, breeding, and releasing this apex predator by the hundreds into forests where it had vanished decades earlier, the skepticism wasn't really about whether the snake was dangerous to people. It isn't. Eastern indigos are non-venomous and are famously docile, almost gentle, even when handled by humans. The skepticism was about whether an 80-year-old wound in an entire ecosystem could actually be repaired by putting one missing piece back in the puzzle. Restoring an apex predator to a landscape sounds simple in a sentence. In practice, it is one of the hardest and most failure-prone things in all of conservation biology. Most attempts fail. The re-released animals starve, wander off, get hit by cars, or simply can't find enough of the specific habitat they need to survive. Nobody was under any illusion that this would be easy, and plenty of experienced wildlife managers privately doubted it would work at all. To understand why anyone thought this snake was worth saving in the first place, you have to go back to what North Florida used to look like before it was logged, drained, and paved. Longleaf pine forest once blanketed more than 90 million acres across the American Southeast, a vast, open, fire-adapted ecosystem of towering pines and wiregrass understory that stretched from Virginia to Texas. It was one of the richest and most biologically diverse ecosystems on the continent, home to gopher tortoises, red-cockaded woodpeckers, fox squirrels, and, at the very top of the food chain, the eastern indigo snake. Then came 2 centuries of logging, agriculture, and urban sprawl. By the time anyone thought to measure what was left, more than 95% of that original longleaf pine forest was gone, replaced by farmland, pine plantations planted in tight, unnatural rows, and eventually suburbs. The eastern indigo snake, which depends on large, unbroken tracts of healthy habitat and travels remarkably far in search of food and mates, simply ran out of room. Making things dramatically worse, the species had an almost symbiotic relationship with another animal that was also collapsing, the gopher tortoise. Indigo snakes rely heavily on the deep, cool burrows that gopher tortoises dig to survive the cold winter months further north in their range. During the Great Depression, hungry families hunted gopher tortoises for food, sometimes pouring gasoline down burrows to flush out rattlesnakes for so-called rattlesnake roundup festivals, killing everything living inside the burrow in the process, indigo snakes included. On top of that, indigo snakes were prized in the exotic pet trade for their calm temperament and striking color. An unregulated collection stripped wild populations even further. By 1978, the collapse was severe enough that the United States Fish and Wildlife Service listed the eastern indigo snake as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, one of the earliest reptiles to receive that designation. In the northern half of Florida, the decline wasn't gradual, it was total. At a stretch of forest along the Apalachicola River known today as the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve, the last confirmed sighting of a wild eastern indigo snake was recorded in 1982. After that, silence. For 35 years, as far as anyone could prove, the apex predator of that forest simply did not exist there anymore. Here is the part of the story most people skip past, because it isn't dramatic enough for headlines. Before Florida could even think about releasing snakes, conservation groups had to spend decades rebuilding the forest itself. You cannot simply drop a predator into a broken ecosystem and expect it to thrive. The Nature Conservancy and a coalition of partner organizations began a painstaking, multi-decade restoration effort at the Apalachicola Preserve, using controlled, prescribed burns to mimic the natural wildfires that longleaf pine ecosystems depend on to keep the understory open and healthy. They worked to rebuild gopher tortoise populations, since a landscape without tortoise burrows is a landscape without shelter for an indigo snake to survive a cold snap. It took the better part of 35 years of unglamorous habitat work before biologists judged the site ready to support the animal it was missing. Only then, starting in 2017, did the actual release program begin. A coalition that eventually included the Central Florida Zoo and Botanical Gardens, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, Auburn University, the Orient Society, and a federal fish hatchery on the St. Johns River set out to do something that had never been attempted at this scale for this species. Breed eastern indigo snakes in captivity, raise them for roughly 2 years until they were large enough to have a real shot at survival, and then release them, cohort by cohort, into the restored forest. The process itself sounds almost like running a boarding school for reptiles. Snakes are bred and hatched at a specialized breeding center in Central Florida, where biologists carefully manage genetics to avoid the kind of inbreeding that can cripple small, reintroduced populations. After their first year, the young snakes are transferred to a national fish hatchery, where they spend a second year growing under close observation before they are finally judged ready for the wild. Each snake is measured, checked for health, and in many cases fitted with tracking technology before release, so that biologists can follow exactly where it goes, whether it finds shelter, and whether it survives. The doubt wasn't irrational. Reintroducing top predators has a brutal track record. Predators sit at the end of long, fragile food chains, and they need enormous amounts of intact habitat, reliable prey, and genetic diversity to establish a breeding population rather than just a scattering of doomed individuals. Wolves, for example, needed protected wilderness spanning hundreds of thousands of acres to make a comeback in places like Yellowstone, and even then it took years of controversy and careful management. Compared to a wolf, an indigo snake might sound almost quaint, but the challenge is structurally the same. You are asking a large predator to relearn how to live in a landscape it has been absent from for generations, using animals that have never experienced the wild themselves. There was also a very reasonable fear rooted in basic biology. Captive-bred animals released into the wild often lack the instincts and experience that wild-born animals develop naturally. Whether that's knowing how to avoid a hungry hawk, finding food efficiently, or recognizing a safe burrow from a dangerous one. Early survival rates for reintroduced reptiles and similar programs elsewhere had, historically, been discouraging. Add in the fact that eastern indigo snakes travel remarkably far during warmer months, sometimes ranging across thousands of acres in search of mates and food, and you have an animal that seems almost designed to wander straight off the protected preserve and into a highway, a housing development, or simply out of the study area entirely. And then there was the sheer scale of the ambition. This wasn't a plan to release a dozen snakes and call it a symbolic gesture. The stated goal, from the very beginning, was to build a self-sustaining wild population, one that could reproduce, expand, and eventually no longer need human intervention at all. Reaching that goal meant releasing dozens of snakes every single year, year after year, for a decade or more, with a long-term hope of the population climbing into the thousands as it spreads and breeds across the reconnected landscape of North Florida and neighboring Alabama. To the skeptics, that sounded less like a conservation project and more like wishful thinking dressed up in a grant proposal. For years, the program simply continued, quietly, without much outside attention. Small cohorts of snakes were released annually. Biologists tracked them. Some vanished. Some were found again months or years later, still alive, still growing. It was the kind of slow, patient science that rarely makes headlines, because there was no single dramatic moment to point to. Until there was. In the fall of 2023, something happened at the Apalachicola Preserve that the entire team had been waiting years to see. Biologists conducting a routine survey discovered 2 juvenile eastern indigo snakes on the property that had not been released by the program at all. They were wild-born. Somewhere out in that restored forest, previously released, captive-bred snakes had found each other, mated, and successfully hatched offspring entirely on their own, without any human involvement in the process. For a program built on the audacious goal of establishing a truly self-sustaining wild population, this was the equivalent of a moon landing. It was proof, not theory, that the missing predator wasn't just surviving in its old home, it was starting to reclaim it. The releases kept growing year over year as confidence in the program's success built. What began with a cautious dozen snakes in that first 2017 release grew into annual cohorts of 20, 30, then more than 40 snakes released in a single year. By the program's 8th consecutive year, the cumulative number of eastern indigo snakes released at just that one Florida preserve had climbed past 160, and when you count the parallel effort launched across the state line in Alabama to restore the western edge of the species' historic range, the combined total pushed past 500 snakes released and counting, with the trajectory pointed firmly upward. Biologists now openly discuss a future where multiple self-sustaining wild populations, breeding and expanding on their own across Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, could eventually mean thousands of these snakes living wild across the southeast once again, a scale that seemed like fantasy back when the very first small group was released into an empty forest in 2017. Wildlife cameras placed near tortoise burrows and along drift fences on the preserve have since captured thousands of images confirming the presence of these animals, and automated tracking technology has detected individually tagged snakes moving through the landscape years after their release, some growing to 6 feet in length or more. Proof that they aren't just surviving, they are thriving, aging, and behaving like snakes that were born there. Here is where the story stops being just about one species of snake and starts being about the health of an entire forest. Every organism in the longleaf pine ecosystem is connected. The gopher tortoise digs burrows that shelter more than 350 other species, from indigo snakes to gopher frogs to burrowing owls. The indigo snake, as an apex predator, helps regulate populations of rodents and smaller snakes, keeping the balance of the food web from tipping too far in any one direction. Fire, historically caused by lightning strikes and once suppressed by decades of misguided forest management, needs to move through the understory periodically to clear out competing vegetation and let native wiregrass and pine seedlings flourish. Restoring the eastern indigo snake wasn't just about saving one charismatic reptile. It was, in the words of the biologists who ran the program, about restoring the complete suite of species to a habitat, treating the ecosystem the way you treat a machine with a missing gear. Replace the part, and the whole system starts running the way it was designed to. Every one of the tens of thousands of acres restored through prescribed burning, every gopher tortoise burrow protected, every mile of longleaf pine forest reconnected across property lines, existed for the specific purpose of eventually being able to support this predator again. In that sense, the indigo snake wasn't just the goal of the restoration effort, it was the final exam. Its survival is the clearest, most measurable proof that the forest itself has actually healed. It's tempting to treat this as a quirky, feel-good local wildlife story, but the implications reach much further than the Florida Panhandle. Predator reintroduction programs around the world are watched closely by conservationists because they test a genuinely difficult question. Can humans, having broken an ecosystem, actually put the pieces back together using patience, science, and sustained funding rather than just letting nature take its unpredictable course? For decades, the honest answer in most cases was rarely, and only partially. What's happening in North Florida offers a rare, hard data point on the other side of that ledger. There's also a more practical angle that deserves attention. Eastern indigo snakes prey on venomous pit vipers, including rattlesnakes and copperheads, and their presence in an ecosystem can influence the local population dynamics of those venomous species. That doesn't mean the goal is to eliminate rattlesnakes. They are native, ecologically important species in their own right, and the two have coexisted for millennia in a natural predator-prey balance. But in areas where human development pushes people and venomous snakes into closer contact, a healthy population of the animals that naturally keep those numbers in check is, at minimum, a quietly useful side effect of doing the ecological restoration right. And there's a broader lesson buried in the sheer, boring persistence this project required. Nobody involved got to celebrate a dramatic victory in year 1, or year 3, or even year 7. The people who ridiculed the idea at the start weren't wrong that it was a long shot. They were only wrong about what long shot actually means in conservation biology. Sometimes a long shot simply means 35 years of unglamorous prescribed burns and habitat mapping, followed by 8 more years of carefully bred snakes released in modest batches, followed by one quiet morning in the fall of 2023 when 2 biologists found something small and dark curled near a tortoise burrow that no one had put there.